when the river overflowed and took out most of the town. The only thing that was left standing was the elementary school and the old water tower. Ellie hadn't thought much about her parents' hometown since she was 8 years old, but she received a phone call that changed everything. Her brother Jamie had disappeared. He was visiting Merriwick to take some pictures for a school project, and then he vanished. The police couldn't find any trace of him, and they stopped looking after a few weeks. So Ellie decided to do her own investigation. According to the locals, the school hasn't been touched since the flood. Yet every night at exactly 11:06 p.m., someone turns on the lights and the clock tower chimes. Ellie was determined to figure out why. And when her flashlight revealed an open window, she climbed inside. She knew she wasn't alone when she heard footsteps, but whoever was there was hiding. As Ellie crept deeper into the building, she heard a voice. It said, "Get back to class." Then she saw him, a young boy with no face. Well, it looked like a face should have been, but all she could see was a dripping wax-like substance. He just stood there and pointed toward the clock tower, which had magically reset itself to 11:06. And then he was gone. That's when Ellie got a message from Jamie. It said, "I'm in detention." At first, she thought it was him, but how could he be sending her texts? Wasn't he missing? She followed the signal, and it led her to the janitor's closet. Inside, she found a dusty box with a clock on top. When she opened it, she saw that it was empty. There was nothing except for a pile of batteries in the corner. As Ellie made her way through the school, she noticed something strange. All the lockers were identical. They were all open, and each one contained a desk and chair. The desks were bolted to the floor, and the chairs looked like they were made out of wax. And all the faces carved into the chairs had melted. It didn't take long for Ellie to realize that the school wasn't abandoned. It was feeding. That was when she started hearing the voices. Over 30 kids were chanting, "Lock the door," but they weren't coming from anywhere. Ellie could hear them all around her. When she looked out the window, she saw the faces of dozens of children staring back at her. They all had the same emotionless eyes and expressionless faces. And then the hallway began to loop. She turned to run, but it just kept going. She could see the end of the hall, but no matter how fast she ran, she never reached the end. She tried calling 911, but the line was dead. And when she turned around, the hallway had changed. Now it was shorter, and there was a classroom at the end. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was an art classroom. On one of the tables sat a drawing of a child. Next to it was a melted wax crayon. Ellie felt something brush against her leg. She turned around, but there was nothing there. Then she heard the voice again. It said, "You're late," and then she woke up. It was 11:06 a.m. The room was empty, and the clock on the wall had reset itself. Ellie realized she was stuck in a time loop. Every hour, the clock would tick backward until it hit 11:06, and then the scene around her would rewind, too. At first, she could only remember being in the classroom, but as the hours passed, she started remembering more of the events that had happened earlier. When she was in the other hall, she had seen a boy carving a face into a wooden chair, and when she tried to grab his attention, he turned around and showed her his face. He didn't look human. Instead, he reminded Ellie of a porcelain doll. His skin was white and shiny, and his eyes were to black marbles. And when he spoke, his voice sounded like nails scratching down a chalkboard. Now that Ellie knew what to expect, she stayed calm and focused on getting out of the school. But when the clock struck 11:06, she was back in the art classroom again. It was like her progress had been erased. Every time she woke up, she remembered less and less of her life outside the school. She forgot what her parents' names were and even forgot that she had a brother. It was like the school was consuming her memories. The halls and classrooms continued to change. Sometimes Ellie would wake up in the middle of a lesson, or she'd find herself locked in a classroom with no door handle. Once she came to in what appeared to be an operating room. She could hear the sound of a heart beating, and she saw a pair of feet covered in bloody surgical gloves. Then the footsteps came closer. At first she thought she'd escaped the time loop, but then the feet stopped right outside the operating room, and she heard the voice. It said, "Go back to class," and the clock reset. Every time Ellie tried to leave the school, she was met with the same obstacles, and she slowly lost her mind. One day she woke up and didn't know who she was. She wandered the halls without a purpose, and the only thing that kept her going was the need to obey the mysterious voice. The last time the clock struck 11:06, she ended up back in the art classroom. It was empty except for the drawings and the melting wax crayons. But this time, Ellie saw something new. On one of the walls was a calendar. It was torn to shreds, but Ellie could make out the date, September 26, 1974. That was the day the flood happened. Suddenly, Ellie heard a voice that sounded familiar. It said, "I'm here to pick up my report card." And then she saw him. Standing in front of her was Jamie. He was holding a drawing of a stick figure, and he was smiling. But then he looked down at his hands, and his smile faded away. He looked confused and scared. "Who am I?" he asked. And that is when Ellie realized that the school wasn't just feeding off the people who entered it. It was also erasing their memories. It had taken her brother's identity. She wanted to tell him who he was, but the only sound that came out of her mouth was a scream. And then the clock hit 11:06. Ellie woke up in the middle of the hall. She was alone. The doors were gone, and the walls were closing in. She could feel the floor vibrating beneath her feet as the walls began to spin. She couldn't make heads or tails of what was happening until she looked down. The tiles on the floor were moving apart. The floor was no longer flat. It was curving downward and leading her somewhere. As Ellie walked along, the lights flickered and the wall started to close in. She was trapped in a narrowing tunnel. And as it got darker, she could see figures emerging from the shadows. They were the children. They were reaching out their wax-covered hands, trying to pull her down into the darkness. She could hear them chanting, "Join us," as she fell. Then everything went black. Some say that the reason we don't remember things is because our brains can't handle the burden of storing irrelevant information. Others say we forget things to protect ourselves from trauma or pain. But whatever the reason, it's clear that some things are better left forgotten. Thanks for listening.